That point having made, first that contentment's a matter of the heart, not experiences, and second now that this affects our judgment and will and affections, to explain what contentment is, we need to understand what it is not opposed to. Contentment is not opposed to a sense of physical pain. Contentment is not opposed to a sense of physical pain. If it were, then it would be impossible for anyone experiencing pain to be content. So it can't be. And we don't say either, like some of the cults, that physical pain is not real, that it's all a matter of the head. And if you can think that physical pain is unreality, you can deal with it. No, there is pain. It is real. God does not want us to pretend that we're not in pain or suffering. And then experiencing pain or admitting it does not destroy our contentment, because it's a matter of the heart, faith in Christ. It's painful, of course, but it doesn't destroy contentment. And it's similar to when we think of grief. Someone can be content and grieve. If someone close to you dies, let's say, a relative or a friend, it is natural to mourn and grieve. It is right to mourn and grieve. And it is wrong not to mourn and grieve. Jesus wept at the sepulchre of Lazarus. But such grief and weeping does not destroy Christian contentment. Now it would if it was a sorrowing without hope, like the pagans mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. But if we sorrow in the will and love of God, out of good, we're still united to Christ, and we're doing it by the power of the Spirit because of love. That doesn't destroy contentment. We can go further and refer this to confession of sin. Contentment is not opposed to the confession of sin. Contentment is opposed to sin because sin attacks contentment. And the more you walk in sin, and the more you don't confess your sin, the more discontent you will be. No doubt about it. Because that sin attacks your contentment, which is a fruit of the Spirit. But contentment is not opposed to the confession of sin. The confession of sin is grievous and painful for us, but contentment actually comes through the confession of sin. And similarly, contentment is not opposed to pouring out your heart to God in prayer, bringing all your distresses and complaints and difficulties, every last one, to the Lord. Touched on that from Philippians 4 verse 6 last week. That's what the psalmist did, poured out their heart to the Lord. That's what Christ did. He did that especially in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he was content in God's will. And his prayers and his difficulty was, and the struggle, though not as if he sinned, was to conform his will fully and submit to it, that he go to the cross. He was content in that, even though it meant pain and struggles and wrestling of prayer. And it's rather as we pour out our heart to God in prayer that our contentment deepens. But this raises the question, what is opposed to contentment? And a closely related question, how does discontentment show itself? How does discontentment show itself? What is opposed to contentment? Think biblically, and think too in your own experience. What do you do? What do those close to you do when they're discontent? And the number one thing that is opposed to contentment, and the number one thing whereby discontentment shows itself, is grumbling, complaining, and murmuring. The classic standing example for the Christian church of all ages is the wilderness wanderings. And the Discontentment was there because most of those who left Egypt were unbelievers. And therefore, without faith, they were discontent. They were discontent with their church leaders, Moses and Aaron. They were discontent with God's way through the wilderness. They were discontent with God's promises, Canaan. They were discontent with God's redemption of them from Egypt. They wanted to go back. And of course, they were discontent with God Himself. 40 years of grumbling and complaining. And how did they show the discontent? They murmured and complained against Moses in their houses, repeatedly, constantly, bitterly. And then they all died, one by one. Carcasses fell in the wilderness. And Paul deals with this in Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. The first 11 verses of this chapter call upon us, as Warfield once put it, to imitate the incarnation. Christ, the Son of God, became nothing, of no reputation, a worm and no man, and went the way of the cross to die for us, and so we must not do things out of strife or vain glory, but in lowliness of mind esteem others better than ourselves. And then after that, imitating the incarnation of Christ, verses 12 and 13 explains we must work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. God has worked it in, and we must bring it to expression in accordance with His Word. Because it's God who works in you, verse 13, a great passage from sovereign grace. God works in you so that you will, you choose, you think, and you do according to His good pleasure. And then after that passage about imitating the incarnation, what it is to follow Christ, and what it is to work out your salvation by the power of sovereign grace, the first thing he says is, do all things without murmurings and disputing. No murmuring, no disputing in anything, because all things are to be done without murmuring or complaining. Because we must learn in whatsoever state we are to be content. Now, that grumbling or complaining is the speaking or uttering of discontent. The heart is unhappy and ill at ease, and then out comes the grumbling. But there is also the inward activity of discontent. The inward activity of discontent is an experience of fretting, worrying, anxiety. And of all the 150 Psalms, the one which, at least to my mind, most deals with fretting is Psalm 37. We should turn to that and look at a few verses. Psalm 37. We'll sing a few verses from this evening, Lord willing. Verse 1 begins, fret not thyself because of evildoers. See, the person's discontent. The evildoer has more wealth. So don't fret, inwardly agitate against him or about him. Then verse 7, latter part of the verse, fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass. And a Christian should never fret about how prosperous the ungodly are, and they've got nice cars, and they fly helicopters, and I can't, and I've got nothing. God doesn't care for me. No, don't fret at the wicked. Verse 8 says, second part, fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. So there's a fretting and an inward anxiety, and then the person gets so agitated that he considers doing evil in order to get his own back against the wicked, or in order to gain wealth by evil means.